Welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast, the show where Papa Tom spreads wisdom like a smear of cream cheese on an everything bagel. Here's your host, Thom Jennings.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast. And I want to, first of all, thank everybody for tuning in. Second of all, I just want to apologize. It's been a bit of a delay. We finally made it to episode number 21. Yay! We are officially legal drinking age as a podcast now that we have 21 episodes. Actually, I think you count those in years, so maybe we're not quite there yet. But just I'm actually still in a bit of a throes of COVID, and that's going to be part of the discussion today on the podcast. The topic is going to be guilt, and it sort of came about with my current bout of COVID and some other things that have come up in recent conversations with people. But it's been a little bit of a rough run, to be honest with you. Nothing too severe. I mean, I had a brother-in-law that passed away. He was in his 60s and had some underlying health conditions, and he passed away. And so that made me more than a little bit nervous when it came on, but I actually started to record an episode on Saturday afternoon, and I had a bit of brain fog, and it was weird. And so started and stopped a few times and just didn't make it through the episode, and I felt fine physically, and I went to work that night, Saturday night, and then Sunday at about 1 o'clock in the morning, it just all of a sudden, it's like a train came in and said, "Bam, I'm coming." The COVID train came and smacked me around a little bit. And Sunday was a very, very rough day. I'm not going to lie. And Monday was better, thank goodness, because that was really the one that worried me the most. Said having lost a relative to COVID, it was like, I don't want to go. I'm not ready to go yet. I'm only 55. But anyhow, here I am. So it did inspire me the last few days of some physical illness and just everything, just dealing with the pandemic. I mean, we've been into this thing for 2 years. I think people are going to look back and maybe listen to something like this in the archives. And hopefully at some point you'll be able to listen to something like this in the archives and go, "Oh man, freaking COVID, man. I'm so over that stuff." And I think that's part of it. I think we're all over it. And honestly, I never would have thought in a million years that I would have caught it. It's, I don't know. I guess it's one of those things that you get to, at any age, you feel a little bit invulnerable. I think in your 20s, at least me, or maybe in my late teens and early 20s, that's why some people get involved in recreational drug use, because you don't really think about the potential consequences. And, then it goes down the road to addiction and overdose and all that kind of stuff. But whenever you have that sense of invulnerability, that's probably when you are the most vulnerable. So, and I know a lot of people are like, "Oh, it's personal health information you don't have to share." But I mean, I will share. I was vaccinated twice, Moderna, and then had the vaccine booster as well. So I kind of was, wandering around society with very little concern. I don't want to say reckless abandon, but I will say reckless abandon. I really did. I really figured everything was over and that I was vaccinated enough. And I mean, I've been exposed to COVID and in rooms with people with COVID so many times. It's just, to me, honestly, it's even a hard time sitting here talking about it in terms of my getting it. I just never thought it would happen. And I'm lucky, because I'm not going to, I don't want to curse it, but I'm likely not going to die of this particular bout of COVID. But it did stir up, I think, a lot of emotions with friends, family, inner emotions. Boy, I'll tell you, if I had a great editor, they could just edit out some of this nonsense, this word nonsense. But anyhow, I think anybody that's had it at this point probably understands that it's very unique, I think, to every individual, because we're just different people, and we handle physical things differently. We handle mental things differently. And certainly with something like COVID, there is a physical and a mental aspect to it. I mean, the physical aspect in my case, I'm 55. I'm overweight. I'm I've got a lot of things going on in life that certainly didn't put me in the greatest spot to catch something like this, but I'm not 75 and overweight, so it at least left me with some better prospects to kind of deal with it, and maybe it's a wake-up call in terms of other things in my life regarding my health and safety and all that. But none of that is technically today's topic. Today's topic is guilt, and it kind of came about because when I first, Sunday when I felt something was happening, we actually had some friends that were scheduled to come over, and I knew that I was dealing with some flu-like symptoms and things like that, and I slept all morning, and they were supposed to come over at about 1:00, and it was like my wife came in, and she's like, are you going to get up, and we got company coming over and all that kind of stuff, and I'm like, listen, I just need sleep a little bit longer. I think I just am worn out, was running around too much over the previous 3 or 4 days. And then it kind of became clear that it was a little bit more than that, that I was getting cold and clammy and everything. So then this was the first stage of guilt. It was like, oh man, I got company coming over. I had friends in from out of town. My sister was in from Savannah, Georgia, literally flew up for a concert that we'd waited for, 7, 8 months. We've had tickets for. It was a concert that by a group called Little Feat. And just to put it in perspective, I own probably around 2,000 records, and I'm a vinyl record collector. And my brother-in-law had asked through my wife, what my favorite record was, and I said it was Little Feat's Waiting for Columbus, which it is. It's my favorite record. And he bought me this beautiful silver record, framed and everything, and it's on my wall. I'm actually looking at it now as I'm speaking. And so this is the importance of that particular record to me. And the group was performing it live from beginning to end. And they were coming up here to spend time with me to go to that particular show. So you can probably hear my dogs in the background. It's going to happen today. I'm going to have to just yell at them every now and then, but whatever. The Little Feat's recording this particular record beginning to end, and it's the first time. Well, they've done it a couple other times. It's the first time they've ever done it on tour, so it was a pretty big deal. They were coming to over by where I lived. So, needless to say, this was not a great day to get COVID. Now, I don't know if there's a great people always say, oh man, my relative died right before Christmas, and there's never really a good time to get COVID. There's never a good time for family members to pass away, but you know what I'm saying. This was a particularly bad time. So I'm dealing with all this guilt. And I mean, even decision one, which was, I got friends coming over. Well, do I tough it out? Do I go through? Because honestly, I come from a generation where if you had any kind of sickness, head cold, a hangover, whatever. I know people may not consider hangover a sickness, but overtired, any physical ailment that kind of drags you down, that like, you went to work or you met your obligations or you just did what you did. I mean, I see, again, I have a small sample size. And I think a lot of times when people always, they talk in terms of absolutes and they go, wow, kids today, they're all horrible workers and millennials are lazy, blah, blah, blah. We all have a small sample size. But I will say that in the last few jobs that I've worked, the sample size that I've dealt with, it seems like people find it easier to call in sick than people from my generation did. I just never called in sick. My mom very rarely called in sick, and she dealt with a lot of issues with my dad. And I know she felt terrible. I mean, my dad would get pulled to the hospital, and she wouldn't even leave work till the end of her shift at some points. I kind of came from that school, like, if you're sick, tough it through it and just try not to touch people or get around people. But obviously we're dealing with a very different age here and a different type of affliction when it comes to COVID. So I was like, I don't know that my wife necessarily thought that it was as serious as it was because I'm an exaggerator and she's whatever the opposite of an exaggerator, realist. I don't know. So she just was kind of chalking it up to, well, you've been out late, you worked late last night, and I'd driven out to Ohio for a concert on, a couple days before that, and she was just thinking, well, this is just an old guy just trying to do too much and in a short period of time, and his body's just worn down. I was like, no, this is something worse. So we made the call to cancel our friend's coming over. And it was, and the other thing that stunk is that at this point, my wife had already cooked this giant roast too. So, all these things are going on. And then, people always say to you when these types of things happen, they go, well, it's nothing. It's not your fault. There's nothing you could have done. It's just circumstances. These things happen. All those trite phrases and everything. But there's still even in that, even in how that is presented to you sometimes, there's always that sort of tinge of guilt, like, oh, you've done something that's just ruined our plans for today. So I eventually, I took the home test. It was positive. We went and got a PCR test, which was a much more comprehensive one. I spent stupid money on it. It was $225. And thankfully it came out of the health savings account, not my actual savings account. But it was positive, and I wasn't all that shocked or whatever. And but before that, since I'd worked with the night before at a bar, I messaged the guy at the bar that I work for and said, hey, I just tested positive with a home kit. So, please let my coworker who I worked with last night know. Or I'll let her know, whichever you want first. He's like, no, I'll let her know. And then when the second one came back, and then he messaged me back about the guilt. I was like, at that phase, I'm like sweating profusely. I've got body aches. I'm not thinking clear. I just physically feel like a train has smacked me. And I just, the message really didn't, I was like, the guilt, like, where the heck is this coming? Like, what does it have to do with anything? What guilt? Like, what guilt do I potentially have to feel? And then it was like, oh my goodness, it is a thing. And over the next 2 or 3 days, because even now that we're at the end of the pandemic, I'm in New York State. So in New York State, when you are testing positive, they send you this lengthy court paperwork, and it says like, oh, you have to quarantine for a certain amount of time. You can't leave your house. You got to stay in a room, blah, all this other stuff. And it's like you leave the house, $2,000 fine. And if you get caught at a mall or anything like that, and it's pretty, like, it's the way it's worded. It's like, man, you're stuck. Like, that's going to happen. So I think when you get that, you automatically feel like you're in a leper category. Like, oh, wow. And mind you, this one's, me, in my case, I'm end of pandemic, just 2 years into this thing. I can't even begin to imagine what it was like for people early pandemic who had to do this for 10 days, and you'd have, spot checks by the health department, all those types of things. It's very scary. And I don't look at it. I'm not one of those people that's like super paranoid about Big Brother or any of that stuff. I certainly believe that the government is doing some things that we don't know about, and history proves that time and time again. But I think at the end of the day, they kind of don't give a crap about a guy like me. They're not overly worried about the type of stuff that I'm doing. There's certainly people doing things that the government wants to really keep an eye on. I'm just one of a gigantic cohort that they're sort of staring at or whatever. But nevertheless, when you get one of these kinds of official legal papers, you're kind of, oh my God, like I'm in the leper colony now. I was like, remember when I was a kid and we would read it in the Bible about lepers. I'm like, lepers? What the heck is a leper? And everybody told all these leper jokes, and I have some fantastic leper jokes, but I don't know if they're politically correct anymore. But maybe someday I'll just do a whole episode on politically incorrect jokes about lepers. No, not going to happen. So, I get all this and everything, and it's just sort of adding insult to injury. And then I start getting text messages from people like, oh, did you tell this person? Did you tell that person? Or, oh, now we got to cancel these plans. Now we got to do this. Now we got to do that. And it's like, holy mackerel, dude. Like the thing about guilt is that it's a strange thing. It's an interesting, I think that guilt is an important component of a human being. I think that if you have guilt, it's a good thing for the most part. my friend Jack, who hopefully will listen to this podcast, I know he listens to a lot. I mean, we've actually had conversations about like the Catholic Church and the concept of guilt. And there's many people in the Protestant community that make fun of Catholics because the Catholics instill guilt upon you. And even Catholics joke about Catholic guilt, you know. And he was actually, it's funny because as before I was recording this, he does these posts on his Facebook page every day, like these mini Catholic things, which I always find very interesting. But it talked about Judas, you know, the Judas kiss. And I actually learned about Judas because I'm into music, and there's a rock band called Triumph, and they had a song called Never Surrender, and it's 30 golden pieces for the Judas kiss, you know. And really, Jack's post about Judas had to do with self-indulgence, things like that. And it's weird, like when I think of Judas, all I think about is guilt, you know, because Judas at some point, now somebody goes to him and says, hey, dude, 30 gold pieces, kiss this guy, and we'll kill him. It's like, you know, I could use the money. So he takes the money. And he does it, but eventually, you know, later on down, and this is all from memory, so if there's any of these biblical scholars out there, I apologize if I'm getting it wrong, but I'm pretty sure at some point Judas takes the 30 golden pieces and chucks them. It's like, man, this was a bad decision. Because he felt guilty about what he did. So that inner guilt can serve a purpose. I mean, it makes you feel bad about things that you've done, and then hopefully prevents you from doing them in the future. So I think in terms of a religion that is talking about sin and things that you shouldn't do, of course, you know, you should feel a little bit of guilt. I mean, think about it in a case, for example, with infidelity. Okay, so if you're a guy or a gal and you're cheating on your spouse and you feel really guilty about it, I used to listen to Dr. Laura, and she always would say, well, you don't need to tell your spouse you cheated on him. You should deal with the guilt, because the guilt is the thing that's going to stop you from doing it again. Because, you know, people say that when you confess, you ease your guilt. Now, in the Catholic terms, you know, that's confession of sins. You know, there's a whole nother layer of things, and that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about interpersonal relationships. You've cheated on your spouse. So in so many cases, and I think people do this too in relationships where they've stolen money from their friends, or they've deceived their friends, or they've done everything, and they say, well, you know what? If I apologize, you have to accept the apology, and now suddenly my guilt is lifted, right? So, oh, well, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that. So now I can go on, my guilt is lifted. And I would think in those cases, the chances of you continuing that behavior, whether it's infidelity, stealing, you know, whatever, is probably going to happen again. So that's one kind of guilt. And sort of the guilt that I'm talking about today in terms of the inner guilt with this whole COVID thing, it comes from the same place, but obviously it has a different function. You know, it's so in the sense that, you know, what my friend was telling me is, he says, you know, you're going to feel guilty because you're basically this walking infection, and you're around people, and then you're going to think about all the people that you could possibly get sick, and if there's anybody close to you and everything. So like in my case, you know, he's got a 4-year-old daughter who at the time was 3 when he caught it. And then, you know, like I have a 4-year-old granddaughter. I've got a daughter-in-law who is immunocompromised with a health condition. I've got a wife, obviously. I've got older brother-in-law. I mean, there's all kinds of people around me that could potentially become infected from me that could not do well. And so there's a bit of that paranoia and guilt. So you're like, oh man, you know, what did I do? Like, what did I do wrong to have this happen to me? And now I have to be the protector of myself and make sure that I don't infect anybody else, you know. But I think that's a reasonable feeling for most people. But sometimes it's a little bit overblown. So I mean, I've had to go through my brain on Saturday night. It's like, well, should I have gone to work on Saturday night? But I didn't have any symptoms. So then I'm like, well, okay. So the point that I could have exposed the most people was at the time when I really didn't feel like I was able to expose people. Now that's the logical side of my brain saying, oh, you know, you did what you could. Everything's good. But the other side of my brain is like, I get what my friend was saying to me, because I am still feeling that inner guilt, and it doesn't, I'm thinking to myself, well, God, you know, maybe I shouldn't have gone to that concert in Cleveland. sat around all those people a couple of days before I got sick. I should have washed my hands more Saturday night. I shouldn't hug people that I saw Saturday night. I still should practice social distancing. So it's not like, even though the logical side, and I have plenty of friends that tell me, I'm not even going to say it because I really don't have people. I don't really have anybody voice sitting in my head going, don't worry about it, Tom. This really isn't any of your fault. In fact, I think, again, we are at such a weird stage of this pandemic that it's really a little bit of the opposite, that there's a lot of people that are well-meaning and they say things and they think, here, consider this, consider that it literally just makes the situation worse. And I've had, even in this, it's Wednesday as I'm recording this, and I was diagnosed on Sunday afternoon. And as I said, I'm starting to feel physically better. Emotionally, it's getting a little bit weirder. Now, the emotional part is due in part to the fact that I've lost my sense of smell, and I'm one of those people that, in terms of mental health, that I use scents to calm down anxiety attacks. I burn incense. I have a Nag Champa soap. I even like to use particular types of hand soap because of the scents, body soaps because of the scents. So while my sense of smell is gone, I realize that my anxiety level is going to be at really new heights. And in fact, I've already found myself to be just incredibly irritable. And it's a strange, people go, oh, really? So you can't smell your incense? So now you're just going to be a jerk? But I don't know. It's a thing. It's real. I wouldn't say it just to make the podcast sound better. It's not particularly interesting, but it's something to think about. But anyhow, those are all the types of things that are going on in my head right now. All this guilt, and I said, I think it was a very surprising after effect of catching COVID. So, and I've, like anything, I think when somebody says something to you and you don't necessarily think about it, it's not necessarily on your radar, then when it does happen, in my case, I go to the internet to try to validate it. And I guess this COVID guilt thing is legit. It's a thing. But, and it's definitely a thing. And it's not a 45-minute thing. So I'd actually intended to tell another story of guilt, because I think guilt as a topic is a fascinating one. My dogs evidently think it's fascinating as well, because you can hear them barking in the background. But I will save that for part 2, because I'm pretty sure I hear a lawnmower and I hear the dogs. So we'll consider this part 1. Part 2 is definitely going to be about guilt. I'm going to tell you an interesting story from my youth about a time that I was questioned by the police when I was a young man, and how I dealt with the guilt of being questioned by the police. So after a short break, I'll be back with part 2 from my COVID-infested studio in Oakville, New York, the Bagel Logic Podcast. All right. Well, that was I think that was the first time in the history of the Bagel Logic Podcast that I've actually taken a break mid-episode. And, as we were talking about, the topic was guilt and COVID and everything. And what's fascinating about this podcast as it evolves and as I record more episodes, they just all kind of take on a life of their own. But, I mentioned, and I think I finished that. The first part of it was, I don't know, yesterday or today. And, it wasn't today. It wasn't earlier today. But even since I recorded that, I know we were talking about just the whole concept of the guilt associated with having COVID and the leprosy and all those other concepts. And, in the interim, in just the amount of time that it took me to break between the part 1 and part 2 of this particular episode, my wife got diagnosed with COVID, and then I laughed. That's a nervous laugh. That's not a like, ha ha ha, my wife got diagnosed with COVID. My wife did, and my sister tested positive as well. So our family total right now is, it started out with me, that my new nickname in the family is Patient Zero, which, whatever. I've had worse nicknames. I was once nicknamed Neckbone. That's a story for another day. And yeah, so I don't know. But, the concept of guilt, as I was kind of touching on, I think guilt is, as I said, it's an important, I don't know what to call it, an emotion. I think it's an important self-regulator, I guess, is the word that I'm looking for. And, not to be too repetitive, but I from what I remember of the first part that I recorded, and we talked a little bit about, said my friend Jack, who had mentioned the story of Judas in the Bible, and we're getting close to Easter, so it's topical in that respect. And again, regardless of what your religious affiliation is, and whether you believe in the Bible is a literal truth or whatnot, I think that there's things in there, that stories that can kind of illuminate the human experience. And that Judas story is certainly one of them. And I said my friend Jack was using it for his purposes, but when I read that story again, I think of the guilt aspect of Judas, and how that at some point in his life he felt the guilt, and it drove him to be a better person. And I had the story that I had originally planned on starting out with. I'll actually tell it now, which it was a story of immense guilt. And I watch a lot of these crime shows like Dateline, NBC, Forensic Files, things like that. I mean, I love those shows. And one of the things that always kind of surprises me is the criminals that will confess when they really just have no reason to confess. I mean, there's nothing in it for them other than easing guilt. I mean, that's what it is. Deep down inside, there's something that is gnawing at them, and because of that guilt, they have to confess. Now, this isn't a perfect comparison to what happened with the guilt that people lay on another person because they have COVID, or a guilt that I feel for something that's beyond my control. That's a guilt for something that you personally do have control over, and I'm like, wow, you watch those, just the police officers like, hey man, you should tell me. And they do the good cop, they do the bad cop, all that kind of stuff. And then in many cases, the person confesses. And I think we perceive that happens a lot more than it does, because I think statistically speaking, you'll see a lot of murders go unsolved. And there are some people that just don't deal with any guilt at all. And I'm not one of those. I'm a person that has always had a profound sense of guilt and feeling bad about situations, whether there are situations that I would have any control over or not. And as I said, I sometimes look at it as a huge. It can be problematic. I mean, it can be to the point where people can use that to manipulate me and say things and whatnot. And I feel bad. I feel guilty. I even had an exchange today with a person that they were trying to book a gig at a place that I book music, and they kind of came at me pretty hard because I told them no. I just didn't think that the act would be a very good fit, and they came back with a line like, well, you're being too judgmental. And I'm thinking, well, gosh, no, isn't it my job to be judgmental as to whether we're going to make money if you perform at the venue or not? And then it was kind of, the person was kind of making me feel guilty for saying that I didn't think that it was something that would work at our particular venue. And I don't know. I said, I don't know how to necessarily process those emotions sometimes. And it's frustrating. But, again, the other type of guilt that we're going to talk about, it's just a story. And I think that one of the things that I really enjoy about when I listen to podcasts is when people tell stories, and they're somewhat interesting stories. So hopefully this is one that you will find interesting as well, even though it took very long to get to it. Now, when I was a young man, I was troubled. I don't want to say troubled like a serious mental problem or whatever. I mean, I was a bad kid. I mean, I was a troublemaker, class clown. Used to get into a lot of situations at school, especially. And there's lots of reasons for that. And if you've listened to the archives, I mean, you have a little bit of a background on my childhood, and it really doesn't matter. I mean, when situations are going on, I mean, everybody's had to deal with certain situations in their childhood that have driven their behavior, good, bad, or indifferent. But when I was in my first year of high school, the school that I went to, Brighton High School, for my freshman year, they had what was called modular scheduling, and it was this sort of new and innovative thing. And the way it worked was the day was divvied up into 18-minute mods. So, like in a traditional school setting now, there's things called block scheduling, where like you have a class for a block of like an hour and a half, or, traditional scheduling would be like a 45-minute class or whatever. These were mods. They were 18 minutes. So a class could be 2 mods, it could be 4 mods, it could be 3 mods. I mean, most of them were 3 mods because that's, 40, that's approximately 45 minutes. I mean, I'm not good at math. So 8 times 3 is 24. So I don't know, 54 minutes, something like that. 44 minutes? 18, I don't know. 18 and 18 is, see, now I'm questioning myself. 36 and 18. Alexa, what's 36 plus 18?
36 plus 18 is 54.
Okay, so 54 minutes. Look at that. Special guest on the Bagel Logic podcast. Alexa. Oh, no, she heard her voice. She's looking at me, waiting for me to ask her something. Anyhow, so we had this modular scheduling, and during the school day, you had what was called free blocks or free mods. So it may be a situation where you had a class from mods 1 to 3, and then mod 4 was open, and you could do what you wanted to do. Typically, you were supposed to use it as study hall or to catch up on things or whatever. But when you had the free mods during a certain period of the day, again, you could choose to go to the media center, library, and in some cases, during a certain portion of the day, you'd actually get to go home. It's pretty cool if you live close, which I did. Now, traditional school punishment would be detention, but in this case, what they would do is before they give you detention, they would take away your free mods, and what they called it was a structured study hall. So if somebody said, you got structure, it would mean that you were in trouble. So you mouthed off to a teacher, or you caught chewing gum, or breaking any kind of rules or whatever. My big thing was, I don't even remember what I used to get in trouble, I think, for talking without raising my hand. And definitely for chewing gum. I used to get the chewing gum thing a lot, which was, for whatever reason, was just a huge deal in school. And so I would constantly be getting structured study hall. Now, the thing is that I've never been to prison. I've been to jail twice, but never for any extended period of time. And but I'm guessing that if you go to prison, that after a while, in as much as when you first get there, the prison guards look at you and go, this guy's a jerk, we're not going to be, but eventually you're going to start getting along, especially if the criminal is not just really a horrible criminal. You know what I mean? So similar was the case with me, like when I used to get detention, even in middle school. And then when I get structured study hall in high school, eventually I'd strike up a relationship with the person that was in charge of structured study hall. Now, the thing about the structured study hall person is that we actually had 2 of them. One was Miss Wickstrom, who was like to me, the only way I could describe her is that she was like the Wicked Witch of the West from The Wizard of Oz. I mean, she just didn't put up with any nonsense at all. Oh, there was a little wind from the west. Did you hear that? That's what we call a peas popping in microphone world. But anyhow, so Wickstrom was the one who just basically, you went to structured study hall, you made sure you showed up with work, you did your work, and if you didn't, then she'd just make your life a living hell. And then there was Miss David, who was another lady, and she was the one who was like everybody's mother, or maybe even everybody's grandmother. I don't know. But she was just one of those ladies that came in and she'd just be like, "Oh, Tom, what happened?" And you could tell her any yarn, and she'd pretend to believe it. like, oh, why do you have structure? I'm like, because just Miss Adair, she just hates me. She's just out to get me, and she just wants to give me structured study hall just for the sake of it. It's like, oh, Tom, I'm sure that you didn't do anything wrong. Well, we'll do something about it. I'll talk to her. But so Miss David, she was a sweet lady. And I think because she didn't have an education degree and she didn't have the pressure of teaching people lessons that she could afford to be that way. Whereas Miss Wickstrom, she was, she's just really good at her job. In all honesty, when you're in structured study hall, you're supposed to be studying and that's what you do. So as a kid, you think, oh man, this lady's rotten, but the reality is that's kind of the role. So anyhow, Miss David, she says to me one day, she said, oh, I saw this ad in the newspaper and they're putting together a theater group. It's an improvisational theater group. And I think that you would be perfect for it because you're very animated, you're very talkative, and you can improvise well. I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's cool. So the basic concept of this particular group, Awareness Theater, was that they got together, I think, 12 or 13 kids from different high schools, different socioeconomic backgrounds, things like that. And they would work with a couple of instructors. One of them was like more of an administrative person. And then I believe her name was Mary Jo. And then this woman named Linda, who was in charge of developing these skits. So we developed skits based on real life situations or supposedly real life situations that impact teenagers. We would present these in almost like a touring fashion. We'd go to, different schools and facilities and things like that. And so we didn't have, as I said, it wasn't scripted. We would be given a scenario. Now, the one I remember the most, I don't know why. Well, I do know why, but it was called The Pill Family. And inevitably, I would play the boyfriend in this improv. And the way it went is you had two people that were the parents, the mom and the dad. And then they had a teenage daughter, and they would find the teenage daughter's birth control pills. First, they confront the girlfriend, and then the boyfriend enters onto the scene, and then they confront the boyfriend because, they're sexually active. And then whatever hijinks would happen because of that. And so, ironically, here I was doing this improvisation on birth control pills and all this kind of stuff. And then I wound up having a kid, I think 1.5 years, 2 years later, because I was 14 when all this was going on at Awareness Theater, in case I didn't mention that before. So it was an interesting situation. I enjoyed it. We were actually getting paid minimum wage for our rehearsals and eventually our performances. Funding was cut at some point, so we stopped getting paid for the rehearsals and only got paid for the performances. But the money was cool. But honestly, even at 14 years old, with what they were paying me, it was either going to record albums, cigarettes, or weed. So it just was like, and it wasn't like a game. It wasn't like I was setting aside any money for college or any of that stuff. But I was basically chosen because I had long hair. I was from a dysfunctional family, even though I was living in an affluent community. So I was like the poor white trash kid, I guess, that was sort of my role within the theater troupe. And we had like a tall African-American kid from the inner city. We had one from Pittsburgh who went through a private school and had super rich parents, doctors. So it was interesting how they sort of crafted this group of people together. But whatever the case, I wasn't necessarily the most beloved by the director because she felt that a lot of times that even though it was an improvisational troupe, she felt that I improvised a little too much. And they actually told us when we were 14 years old that we could swear during the different skits. So anyhow, I've been doing this thing with the group for a little while. There was definitely some tension between me and the director, and it was, I still had things going on at home that was pretty crazy at the time and everything. And so there was this one kid. I think his role was just like the nerdy, quiet kid from Pittsburgh, and his name was Brian. I had so many Brians in my life that have had an impact on me, both good, bad, indifferent, and everything in between. It's just a very common name, I guess. But I could almost do an entire podcast on just Brians, the Brians in my life. But So here it is. So we're in this group together, and then Brian was this kind of nerdy kid, and I got along with most of the people in the theater troupe, and I'll tell you the funniest thing was, I'm not to get too far off track, but since we are talking about awareness theater, I'll never forget. So the big thing was that year was the Moving Pictures record by Rush came out. If you're not familiar with this song called Tom Sawyer, it's 40th anniversary this year. So I remember, here I was, this kid, I was like, just couldn't afford good clothes. I had long hair, I smoked cigarettes. I was just a kind of a bad kid. And these two Pittsburgh kids invited me out to a party at some barn in the middle of nowhere. Now I show up to this thing and I'm thinking, it's going to be prep central and we're all going to be drinking Kool-Aid and, watching TV or something. And, the one kid says to me, he's like, "Hey man, bring your copy of Moving Pictures, okay?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure, no problem." So I brought my copy of Moving Pictures and came with me, and I get there and the barn's there. There were more drugs and sex and craziness going on at this rich kid's house than I think I've ever seen before or since. And I just remember listening to the side 2 of Moving Pictures and it just being crazy, just sitting there. And I didn't really indulge in a lot of things because that kind of stuff freaked me out. And I've talked about, my personal experiences with street drugs and things like that. So I just remember just sitting there listening to this Rush record and looking at how the other half lived and thinking, man, the world thinks that I'm the bad guy and all us poor white trash kids are the ones that are doing the drugs and having sex and creating all the world's problems. But this is where it's really happening, And I guess when you read about these corporate parties in Wall Street and everything like that, it gives you a better sense that, yeah, rich people party a lot harder than us poor people. Trust me. They just don't get caught, I guess. I don't know what it is. So anyhow, I'm still with this awareness theater thing, and this is after the Rush incident. And this kid Brian, he was kind of a geeky dude, and just I don't know. We had rehearsed at this small building. We used to rehearse anywhere we could rehearse, any place that would let us, any public facility. And in Brighton, New York, they had this little house. It wasn't an actual house that people lived in, but it looked like a house and it had a basement. It was a facility that was owned by the town of Brighton. And they had some open area. And then, that's right, it was part of their recreation center or whatever. And it was a small thing. And they had the big thing was they had an air hockey table in there. And you know what? I love air hockey. So anyhow, we're hanging out in the basement, me and this Brian kid, and we're playing air hockey. And I think it was maybe, a week or two before my family had gone up to Toronto, Canada. And at the age of 14, probably at the age of about 11, I discovered this thing called fire. My dad was stupid enough to teach me how to light matches when I was a very young man. So I used to set my Matchbox cars on fire in my bedroom, and I would have small fires anywhere that I could burn stuff, and I still love to burn stuff. I'm not an arsonist. I don't burn down buildings, but we'll get to that in a moment. And so, but I really loved exploding stuff. So firecrackers. To me, firecrackers were just the greatest thing ever. And, the two things I loved were, we used to play this game where we would take a tennis can and we would soak the tennis ball in gasoline and light it and then kick the tennis ball around. And it would look like this flaming meteor between two different people. And it was great. It was just pure joy as a child. And it would be funny, your foot would get on fire and everything because of the gas and I don't know. But that and firecrackers. Firecrackers, I used to love blowing them up in people's mailboxes and, again, blow up old toys. I was like Sid from Toy Story, if you've ever seen him, but on a much smaller degree. Well, anyhow, my dad had bought me some firecrackers up in Toronto. Now people listening are probably going, firecrackers weren't always legal in Toronto. This is true. And it was kind of like, I don't know, I hear people today, they go to these stores where they sell CBD, at least in New York State, and you can't sell marijuana. But I feel like if you ask for marijuana, they're just going to give it to you anyway. So that's kind of how it was at the fireworks stores in Toronto at that time. So my dad went in and he's like, do you guys sell firecrackers by any chance? And the lady behind the counter was like, shh, don't say anything. And then she hands him this bag, and it's a bag of firecrackers. So we bought firecrackers. We brought explosives over the border from Canada. How things were different back then. And so anyhow, I had this pack of firecrackers. Man, I love firecrackers. And I was blowing them off. And we had just played, Brian and I were playing air hockey, and the director was getting ready to leave. And she's like, all right, man, it's just you two left in the building. I said, yeah, can we finish up this air hockey game? It's a pretty good one. It's like, all right, just make sure you lock the door behind you. So everybody leaves, and we get to talking, and then I said to Brian, I said, hey, man, I got some firecrackers. He's like, you got firecrackers? Yeah. He goes, well, let's blow one off in here. And I go, blow one off in here? I said, that's crazy. It's like, okay, let's do it. So I blew off a few firecrackers inside the building. I remember it was like, there was like a bench that had like this hole under it, and I threw a firecracker under there, and it exploded, and, blah, blah. Didn't think much of it. There was some smoke in there or whatever, but, we left the door open and the smoke went out and everything. Then we finished the air hockey game and then took off. So, I don't know, it's 2 hours later maybe, I get a phone call, and it's from the director lady. She goes, hey, did you lock the door when you guys left? I said, yeah. She goes, what time did you leave? And I told her, and she says, well, the fire department's there. The building's on fire. I'm like, what? The building's on fire? So I'm freaking out, right? So I didn't live very far from this place. So I remember I hopped on my bicycle. I bike all the way down to this recreation center building. See all the police and the fire department and everything. I mean, this is like literally on the next to the police station. Like, we're talking, you could have opened the window of this building and chucked a rock and hit the police station easily. Like, you see police cars outside the window. The fire department was about a quarter of a mile up the road. So, they're obviously freaking out. Like, oh my God, there's somebody set a fire. Now I didn't really see any flames coming out of it. It wasn't like this huge fire or whatever, but there's smoke billowing out of it. And I'm standing there. I'm like, holy crap, man, this is amazing. Now, me, the idiot, I decide that I'm going to tell somebody in some official in authority. I go, hey man, I was the last person to leave the building tonight, me and my buddy Brian. And they said, really? I said, yeah. And they go, well, we need to talk to you. I'm like, okay. Now, at this point, I had not mentally put two and two together that this fire had started because I had blown a firecracker off in the building. And so they were asking me, what time did you leave? What were you guys doing? I'm like, oh, Brian, I'm wearing his theater, and Brian and I were playing air hockey and all that kind of stuff. I'm like, oh, okay. And I go, well, what was the deal with the fire? And they told me the area that the fire started. And I was thinking immediately at that point, I said, oh boy, that is where I blew off the firecracker. This is not good. So at that point, I was like, dang, I better do some damage control. So I kind of, didn't say much. And they said, hey, they'll give me a call, the next day or whatever. And I hightailed it home. I called Brian up. I go, Brian, listen, dude, the cops are going to talk to you because you and I were the last two people to leave. Do not say anything about us blowing firecrackers up in there, because I'm pretty sure that our firecrackers were what started that fire. And he's like, yeah, no problem. So now I'm putting my life in the hands of this kid who, by the way, I never saw the kid again after this incident. Like, it was weird. I mean, we were still in the theater group together for a little while, but they wound up kicking us out not much longer after that, but I'll get to that. And so I told him, and then I'm freaking out. And, my dad was the kind of dad who I'd gotten in so much trouble as a kid that if anything had happened, they just assumed I did it. Like, there was never any arguing about it, Oh, they just found a dead body next door. It's probably my kid again. So I knew that I wasn't going to have a real strong advocate in Dad. So my mind is like, oh God, no matter what, man, I just got to keep my freaking mouth shut. I just got to keep my mouth shut. It was an accident. I didn't mean to set the fire. But if I tell him what I was doing, I'm in a whole heap of trouble, man. I'll probably get sent to some juvenile detention facility. So it's like, okay, so the next day the police pull us in. And my dad's there and I'm there, and this is my first experience with any kind of police interrogation. Now, when we first went down to the police station, I thought it was just, we were just going to like talk to the officer. Well, they brought us into one of those rooms like you see on television, the two-way mirror, small, one color, and they just went straight good cop, bad cop on me. So the first cop just did straight on bad cop. He came in and he goes, all right, we know you did this. So let's just cut to the chase, and I'll take a statement. You can sign it. There'll be some restitution involved, and we'll be able to move on. And I'm just like, nope, not saying a word. And this, again, goes back to the whole concept of guilt. I mean, trust me, I'm feeling guilty because I know I did it. And I'm just like, oh, my God, I can't say anything because I just don't want to deal with the repercussions of it. And so then they did the whole full court hard press. I mean, literally, like, this police officer was just, did the whole thing like, hey, man, we know that you're a punk kid and you've done all these things in your youth and you were always getting structured study hall and detention and things like that. And you're definitely the one that did this. And I'm just sitting there like, I probably should have just peed my pants right there. I was so scared. But I mean, I'm shaking. I'm freaking out. So I make it through bad cop. And now, mind you, I didn't know such a thing existed until this whole thing went on. So I survived bad cop. And then in rolls good cop. I remember this guy like that was yesterday. His name was Officer Flood, Bill Flood. And sweet guy. Just really nice. And actually for years afterwards, anytime that I used to get in trouble with the law, which happened, and I'm not making it sound like I did anything. I mean, it was nothing big. I mean, most of the stuff I get in trouble for would be like spray painting walls or whatever. But anyhow, so Bill Flood comes in and he just goes total good cop on me. He's like, hey, Tom, I'm really sorry. You seem really stressed out, but we just got to figure out what's going on about these things. And he goes, I'll tell you why Officer Jones was so upset. It's because of Steve. He's a volunteer fireman. And while he was one of the first responders to the fire, and he went to the fire, and there was smoke coming out of the building. He went to smash the window out to let the smoke out. And his arm got all cut up. He pulled it back through the window. His arm got cut up, and he's never going to have use of his right arm again. And it's just a horrible situation. And you know what? For his sake, we just want to find out who did this. Now, you want to talk guilt. I mean, at that point, I thought to myself, man, my stupidity has now created a situation where a guy will never use his right arm again. And it was interesting, too, because I had a situation when I was a kid where my hands went through a window and they got cut up. And I still have the scars. I mean, this is, man, almost 50 years ago now. And I almost died. I mean, it almost hit my artery. So I could relate to the whole scenario. And I mean, it was bad. And I'm just like, deep down inside, I'm just racked with guilt. And I felt awful. I mean, I felt awful for quite some time. And for a few months after that, I just was like, I mean, very mopey, very depressed, just thinking I am the scourge of society. I mean, here I am. I'm my stupidity, playing with a firecracker and start a fire. And now there's a volunteer fireman out there who doesn't have the use of his right arm because of me. And, I think at that point, even at 14, the depression really kicked in. I mean, I started using drugs a little bit more, and I was really bummed, and I was partying a lot more. And so said it was about 3 months later, I was at this party, and it was at a friend's house in Brighton. There was a whole bunch of us there. There's drinking and craziness going on and everything. And now, people that know me, and again, you don't even necessarily have to know me, but as I've mentioned before, if I can talk at an hour a clip, which this episode will probably be around that level, that I tend to be a very sociable kind of guy. And so I'm at this party, and there's this guy there, and we're just sitting there, we're smoking a joint, and we're talking and drinking beers underage, because that's what you did back in the 80s. You know, like, if my grandchildren ever listen back to this podcast, they go, man, that's what they did when they didn't have cell phones. So I'm hanging out, and this guy and I are chatting and everything. And I look down, and he's got like some gauze on his arm. And I go, hey man, I said, what happened? He goes, oh dude, you remember that fire that they had up at the Brighton Recreation Building? I go, yeah. He goes, yeah, man, freaking arm went right through the window, got it all cut up. I go, wow, that's awful, man. Like, are you going to be okay? He goes, yeah, it's just been some stitches, man, everything like that. I mean, honestly, the whole thing is going to heal up pretty well. I just feel like an idiot, you know, like I had these damn bandages on for a few months because I didn't take care of it and got infected and everything. But no, it's really not a big deal. I mean, there's no loss of use of my hand or any of that stuff. And I remember sitting there thinking like, thank the freaking Lord that I ran into this guy. Because you know what? Honestly, if I hadn't, I don't know that if I would have ever been able to forgive myself. I don't know if I ever would have been able to deal with the guilt. Now, mind you, even with that whole incident, because it was, I don't know if it would technically be considered arson because it was an accident. We were setting out firecrackers and we were just dumb young kids. But, you know, that police officer had said, you know, someday with this, somebody's going to confess and they're going to get arrested and they're going to do time for this, you know, the whole 9 yards. And man, let me tell you, I didn't even tell this story to anyone at all for 30 years after the incident. And then one day I was in a car, and I believe it was my son, Thom, that I eventually told the story to. So there was a certain degree of guilt that went along with that. But man, you know, just imagine like what my life would have been if I hadn't run into that guy. And to this day, I would have thought, oh man, there's somebody out there that doesn't have the use of their right arm because of my stupidity, you know? And I guess there's a couple of lessons that sort of tie this whole episode up into a tiny little bundle, because it's gone about 85 different directions. But trust me, there's some connections. So, you know, going back to the whole discussion at the beginning of the podcast with my situation with contracting COVID, you know, and having people reaching out, and, you know, just that general feeling that you get from people like, oh, you know, you were irresponsible and now you could potentially get other people sick. And I mean, in this case, other people did get sick because I'm patient zero on some tree or whatever. You know, people, you can use that. You can use that against people, and and you really have to think about that. You have to think about it you have to think about it long and hard before you want to use guilt as a weapon on somebody, because it's powerful and it's painful and it hurts people. Now, in the case of the police officer, they used it as a means to try to extract a confession out of me. And, you know, I don't necessarily fault the police officer for doing it. I suppose that's some kind of tactic that they taught at the academy. But there's a level of unfairness about it too. You know, you're going to tell somebody that potentially that they've caused irreparable harm to an individual, that even if, let's say, the situation had been that this person didn't have use of their right arm, I don't know, man. Like, I don't know why you would lay that guilt on another individual to the point where it could just create permanent damage, permanent emotional damage. And trust me, I'm not trying to make it sound like, oh, I'm not the idiot that caused the fire. I caused the fire. And in some ways, I'm not saying that I'm not the idiot that contracted COVID, because, you know, I went to a concert in close quarters with other people, wasn't wearing a mask, wasn't doing protocols, you know, washing my hands with sanitizer and all that stuff. Listen, man, trust me, I feel bad about that kind of stuff. But I hope if you're a purveyor of guilt, if you're the kind of person who just likes to dish it out, stop. Just stop. It's not good. If you are a person that deals with guilt, it's okay. That's who you are. That's self-regulation. That's okay. Don't let it eat you alive. Try to put it into perspective. Try to think about it. That's not necessarily going to make it go away. I mean, these aren't words that just are basically, it's like that commercial they have on depression, like, oh, get over it. I guess it goes back to a lot of the things that the sort of the recurring theme of the Bagel Logic podcast is that, we all experience those types of emotions. It's okay. Experience them, learn from them, and understand that you're not the only person that has to deal with those on a regular basis. So, and with that, wow, I hopefully you got something out of this episode. I know that arson story is not one I've told many times, but it's something that it's a little bit easier to tell now, as I said, because I know that it'd be interesting if I was ever able to find that person who did cut their arm and maybe have a adult conversation with them, or even have them on the podcast. And that even at that interaction, there was a part of me that just wanted to look at him and say, hey man, I'm really sorry. And I know the statute of limitations is over, at least I assume so, with regard to that particular incident. And, even if it's not, I don't know that it would necessarily be something that would warrant my going to jail over this many years later. But, as one of my favorite expressions goes, it is what it is. But with that all being said, I hope you enjoyed this episode, a long one, and hopefully a fruitful one, hopefully one that you enjoy. We've got a guest coming up on the next one, and we've had a few reviews and some ratings and stuff that have gone up on the different podcast formats, and if you take the time to do that, I would certainly appreciate it. And to all my listeners, family, friends, foes, people who I may have harmed, people that have made me feel guilty, I hope I've not done the same to you in return. And with that, I will say thank you from me, your host, Thom Jennings, Mr. COVID Jennings this week. And I'll see you next time on the Bagel Logic Podcast.